How is it possible that Oscar Piastri went from not completing a single lap all season to humiliating McLaren's internal data and leaving his own engineers at Suzuka without answers? Because what happened after his first podium in the Japanese GP not only surprised the paddock, it set off all the alarms within the team. The Japanese Grand Prix should not be the scene of a feat, it should simply be a test of survival for McLaren, and especially for Oscar Piastri. They arrived at Suzuka with a completely bleak outlook, having a start to the season that bordered on the unacceptable for a champion team. 2 races, 0 laps completed, critical problems in the power unit and a car, the MCL40, which in practice was more of an unknown than a competitive tool. The internal situation was much more tense than it seemed from the outside. It wasn't just mechanical failures, but a total disconnect between what the team thought they had built and what they actually had on the track. The engineers worked practically blind, without real race data, without reliable references, and with increasing pressure to prove that the car's full potential was not an illusion. In that context, Suzuka represented the first serious test, but also the most dangerous. And this is where something unexpected begins to build. From the first moment on the track, Piastri showed signs that did not fit with the team's previous narrative. It wasn't just competitive, it was consistent, precise, and, above all, surprisingly comfortable in a car that until then had been virtually untamable. While McLaren hoped to simply validate that the problems were resolved, the Australian began to push the limits in a way that no one within the team had anticipated. But the most shocking thing was not seen in the timetable, it was seen in the data. Each lap he completed began to reveal entirely new patterns. Sectors where the car had to suffer suddenly became strong points. High-speed corners where the MCL40 had shown weakness in simulations were now executed with a stability and speed that defied all of the team's internal logic. It was as if someone had suddenly unlocked a hidden version of the car. This phenomenon generated an immediate reaction within the McLaren wall. The engineers began to analyze the telemetry almost in real time, comparing each corner entry, each acceleration phase, each energy management, seeking to understand what was happening. But the more they analyzed, the more disconcerting everything became. They didn't find errors, they didn't find anomalies. They found pure performance that they didn't know they had. And in the midst of all this, Piastri not only executed, he led. He even commanded the race at several points, something that hours before would have seemed completely out of place. That leadership was not circumstantial. It was a direct consequence of a perfect reading of the car, of a capacity for adaptation that exceeded even the most optimistic internal expectations. When he finally crossed the finish line in second position, achieving McLaren's first podium of the season, the result was already historic due to the context. But what was really important was not in the trophy, it was in what had been exposed. The MCL40 had a potential that the team itself did not fully understand. And that discovery, more than relief, generated a new, much bigger mystery. Because if this car was capable of doing this overnight, the real question was no longer what had happened in Japan, but how far they could go from now on. The moment McLaren understood that something didn't add up wasn't during the race. It was when they began to break down every piece of data that Oscar Piastri had generated. Because what seemed like a great weekend on the track, on the team's computers, became something much more disturbing. A positive anomaly that they could not explain. This is where the real core of the story comes in. The engineers began to compare the Suzuka telemetry with absolutely everything they had recorded since the start of the season. Australia and China had been a disaster, yes, but they had also left simulations, predictions, models of car behavior, and nothing matched what they were seeing now. It was as if the MCL40 was operating under a completely different set of rules. The first critical point was energy management. One of the car's biggest problems in the early races had been uneven power delivery, especially at key moments of acceleration. However, in Japan, the data showed something radically different. A much cleaner, progressive, and constant release of energy. There were no sharp peaks, there were no unexpected drops. There was stability. And in Formula One, stability is pure performance. But the really disconcerting part came when analyzing the high-speed corners. Sectors like the S's or the 130 were not only competitive, they were extraordinary. Piastri was maintaining higher minimum speeds than his rivals without relying on a higher straight top speed. This completely broke with the traditional approach of the car up to that point, which had shown clear weaknesses compared to other teams in those areas. Here they were not only being competitive, they were making a difference. Engineers began to suspect that it could be a very specific combination of configuration, track conditions, and driving style. But even that explanation fell short. Because by isolating variables, by replicating scenarios in simulation, by trying to reconstruct those laps, They simply could not reproduce what Piastri had done on the track. And that is where the most uncomfortable element for the team appears. The driver was extracting performance that the car in theory should not be able to offer. Not because the car was slow, but because that level of efficiency was not provided for within their own models. This generated a very deep internal debate. Had they underestimated the aerodynamic potential of the MCL40? Was it a data interpretation problem from the beginning? Or had Piastri simply found a performance window so narrow that no one else had been able to detect? The reality is that everything pointed to a combination of factors, but with a clear protagonist: the way in which Piastri was using the car. His ability to maintain downforce in fast corners, his precision in throttle management, and his reading of the car's balance were creating a completely new scenario for the team. And this changes absolutely everything. Because it's no longer about improving the car, it's about understanding it. McLaren went from trying to solve problems to trying not to lose that unexpected performance they had just discovered. The team's focus transformed in a matter of hours. But here comes the most important thing. When a team discovers that its car can perform more than it thought, it also discovers something much more dangerous: that it has been competing far below its true level. And that realization is what makes Suzuka a turning point. Because from that moment on, McLaren is no longer reacting, it is beginning to understand. The true impact of what Oscar Piastri did at Suzuka is not measured in a second place. It is measured in what he caused within McLaren in the days that followed. Because when a team discovers that it has been misreading its own car, everything changes. The first thing that happened was a complete change of focus. McLaren stopped thinking in terms of fixing problems and began to work under a new premise: not to lose what they had just found. This is key because in Formula 1 many times improving does not mean going faster, but understanding why you were fast in the first place. And in this case, they didn't even have that answer completely clear. The engineers began to rethink all their tools: simulators, data correlation, base configurations. Everything they had built since the preseason began to be questioned. Because if the car had shown that level at Suzuka, then there was a much higher performance window than what its models indicated. And that is dangerous, but it is also a huge opportunity. From there, a domino effect was generated. The technical meetings stopped focusing solely on aerodynamic evolution or reliability and began to revolve around a much more complex question: how to replicate exactly what Piastri did. Because it's one thing to achieve exceptional performance in one weekend, and quite another to turn it into a constant basis for the entire season. And here appears the critical point that can change everything. If McLaren manages to understand and stabilize that performance, we are not talking about a team that is competitive again. We are talking about a team that could alter the balance of forces on the grid. Because the potential that the MCL40 showed in Japan was not marginal, it was structural. But there is also the other side of risk. If they can't fully understand that behavior, if it was too specific a combination of unrepeatable factors, then Suzuka could remain an isolated peak, an illusion of performance that never solidifies. And that is the silent fear within the team. Meanwhile, Piastri has changed his position within the team. It is no longer just a fast driver or a promise. It has become a technical reference. His feedback, his driving style, and his way of interpreting the car are now key pieces in the development of the MCL40. In other words, the team begins to revolve around what he has discovered on the track. And this brings us to the most important consequence of all. McLaren no longer competes with certainties, it competes with a new ambition. Because now they know that their ceiling is much higher than they thought. What happened in Suzuka was not just a podium. It was the moment McLaren stopped looking for answers and started asking the right questions. And that, in Formula 1, is exactly where the teams that end up winning start. What we saw at Suzuka with Oscar Piastri wasn't just a great performance. It was the exact moment McLaren discovered it had been racing below its true potential without even knowing it. Because this first podium was not built on progressive evolution, nor on obvious improvements. It was built on something much more powerful and dangerous: the unexpected discovery of real performance. A performance that was not in his simulations, that was not in his predictions, but that appeared on the track thanks to the way in which Piastri interpreted the car. The big question that remains is not whether they can get back on the podium. It's whether they can turn that performance into a consistent basis. Because if they achieve it, this team stops being a surprise and becomes a real threat for everyone. Was Suzuka the beginning of McLaren's true level? Or just a flash impossible to repeat? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.